From Ground Zero, this is Democracy Now! In Exile, the War and Peace Report.
I purposely want to stand next to Muslims and Christians and Jews and members of all other faiths for one simple reason: because terrorism does not want us to stand together. The most effective response here is that we of different faiths stand together.
We do not want to become the evil that we condemn, and I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
People flee Afghanistan fearing a U.S. attack. We go to Lebanon to speak with Robert Fisk, who interviewed Osama bin Laden, and we'll hear from peace activists who march throughout the country. Stay with us. Welcome to Democracy Now! In Exile, Resistance Radio, breaking the sound barrier. I'm Amy Goodman. Pakistan sent a group of high-ranking military officers to Afghanistan today to demand the Taliban government hand over the accused Osama bin Laden and his top associates to the United States or face almost certain U.S. military action. The group is led by one of the top officers in Pakistan's military intelligence wing, which is thought to have unique intelligence on bin Laden's operations in Afghanistan and his whereabouts. But Pakistani officials caution that the chance of the Taliban bowing to the American demand is slim. The Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, has already said in a defiant, warlike radio speech on Friday he believed handing over bin Laden would not spare Afghanistan from a U.S. attack. The Pakistani president, General Pervez Musharraf, agreed to relay the ultimatum after days of intensive discussions with U.S. officials. General Musharraf reportedly assured President Bush in a telephone call on Saturday that Pakistan would allow the use of its airspace and airfields if needed, as well as full access to Pakistani intelligence on bin Laden. According to the Pakistani officials, U.S. officials had told General Musharraf's government that Washington would use every lever short of war to punish Pakistan unless it cooperated. General Musharraf was said to have made a number of demands in return for Pakistan's cooperation, including an end to economic sanctions imposed by Washington after Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in 1998, the lifting of an American ban on weapons sales, a pledge that Washington would assist Pakistan's battered economy by encouraging generous treatment by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and a shift in Pakistan's favor in its dispute with India over the Kashmir region. Meanwhile, Pakistani civilians gathered to protest their government's collaboration with the United States. This news from Afghanistan: tens of thousands of Afghans are streaming out of major cities and headed toward the borders with Pakistan and Iran amid fears the United States is preparing to unleash a war on the land that has harbored Osama bin Laden. Iran has sealed its border with Afghanistan. Taliban officials of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement have also started to flee the capital, Kabul. Yesterday, the Taliban ordered all foreigners out, saying their safety could no longer be guaranteed. These who couldn't leave were bracing for war, stocking up on food as prices soared and the Afghani currency slid. Meanwhile, Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban supreme leader, summoned religious scholars to the capital to discuss waging a jihad, a holy war against the U.S. Nearly 1,000 elders and Islamic scholars from across Afghanistan are expected to attend a meeting tomorrow. More than 3,000 U.S. Marines and sailors rehearsed helicopter and ship-to-shore landings off East Timor Sunday amid expectations of a revenge strike over the terror attacks on New York and Washington. The task force from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit and Amphibious Squadron 1 had been due to disembark troops for humanitarian work in Dili, the capital of Swai and Waikusi enclave in Indonesian West Timor. Instead, 3 amphibious ships led by the 40,000-ton USS Peleliu stayed off the north coast of the capital, practicing naval and air maneuvers with Harrier jets, helicopters, and landing craft. Before 2 passenger jets slammed into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center and a third into the Pentagon in Washington, the warships were on a routine 6-month deployment to the Western Pacific and Arabian Gulf. U.S. Army spokesperson Major Paul Van Bremen told Reuters in Dili the task force is due to sail for the Waikusi enclave today to deliver humanitarian supplies before heading to Singapore. He said, after that, I'm not really sure they'll go, but they're part of a much bigger force. And Bush administration officials said yesterday they're considering lifting a 25-year-old ban on U.S. involvement in foreign assassinations and loosening restrictions on FBI surveillance. They said the Justice Department plans to send a wide-ranging set of proposals to Capitol Hill this week that would include more power to conduct wiretaps, detain foreigners, and track money laundering cases. Vice President Cheney said yesterday that CIA field officers may be allowed to recruit and pay overseas agents linked to terrorist groups and human rights abuses, saying it was necessary to infiltrate suspected terrorist cells. In addition, Florida Democratic Senator Bob Graham, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, says he'll introduce a counterterrorism package next week that would create a counterterrorism czar inside the White House and establish authority for the CIA to recruit unsavory agents. And Secretary of State Colin Powell says the administration is reviewing an executive order issued by President Gerald Ford in 1976 that bans U.S. personnel from engaging in or conspiring to engage in assassinations. Some intelligence and terrorism experts have advocated assassinating Osama bin Laden, the exiled Saudi millionaire who lives in hiding in Afghanistan and has been named by the United States as the prime suspect in last week's attacks. The Senate last week approved legislation that would make it easier for the FBI to get warrants for electronic surveillance of computer transmissions. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Patrick Leahy, the Vermont Democrat, called the measure overly broad and an encroachment on civil liberties. He said we have to be careful in our horror and revulsion over this horrendous and terrible act that we don't start giving away the freedoms that make us different from terrorists. Several Democrats said many senators did not know exactly what they were voting on and supported the measure in their determination to condemn terrorism. Time will tell. Bob Marley and the Wailers here on Democracy Now! In Exile, Resistance Radio. I'm Amy Goodman. Officials from Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement have started to flee the capital Kabul amid growing expectations of U.S. attacks. Fear of reprisal has triggered a rush to get families out of the cities. Thousands of people have flooded over the eastern border to the already overflowing refugee camps of Pakistan. Those who couldn't leave are bracing for war, stocking up on food as prices soar and the Afghan currency slides. With Iran announcing it is sealing its eastern border with Afghanistan, opposition fighters controlling a narrow northern corridor, and Pakistan pledging to support U.S. anti-terrorism efforts, Kabul residents are feeling increasingly vulnerable. Afghanistan is already one of the poorest countries after more than 20 years of invasion, occupation, and civil war. A team of senior Pakistan officials is to fly to Kandahar today to press the ruling Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden and help prevent a potential catastrophe in the region. The Taliban, however, continue to insist neither they nor bin Laden had the capacity to organize an international plot that saw trained pilots hijack large passenger jets in Boston and Washington. The spiritual leader of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement, Mullah Muhammad Omar, yesterday called an urgent council of senior Islamic clerics to discuss the situation. Mullah Omar on Saturday issued a call for jihad against the United States and neighboring states such as traditional supporter Pakistan if they attacked or assisted an attack on Afghanistan. We're joined right now by Thomas Guittierre. He serves as the Dean of International Studies and Programs at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and is the Director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at UNO. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Good morning.
It's good to have you with us. Well, can you tell us the latest you're hearing now from Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not hearing much. Afghanistan doesn't have much electricity and has no trunk lines, but what I'm hearing, of course, is that we have a situation where the Pakistanis are meeting with the Taliban to try and convince them to turn over Osama bin Laden, as you indicated. And I think there's an important element to this whole matter. Well, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden were brought together, in fact, by the Pakistanis in the late spring and summer of 1996. The Pakistani military has had a strategic objective in Afghanistan and Central Asia, largely because of its concern about its eastern borders. So Afghanistan being to the west has been the central piece in something that the Pakistanis call strategic Islamic depth. And in Afghanistan, after the Soviet War, due to reasons that are too long to go into here, but there was a vacuum that was created by the inability of any of the resistance parties to come to put together an effective government. And eventually the Pakistanis, who had been backing some of them, realized that they were not going to be successful and backed the Taliban, another group that rose up in Afghanistan during this period. And it was a group that was very dependent upon Pakistan's military, particularly its intelligence, military strategy, and also recruits from Pakistan's extremist religion madrasa schools. And thousands literally came to Afghanistan to fight on behalf of the Taliban against the other particular warlords within Afghanistan. When I was there in 96, 97 working with the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan, I saw convoys of these people, none of whom could speak Persian or Pashto, the two major languages of Afghanistan, because they were indeed not Afghans. Into this mix, the Pakistanis brokered the return of Osama bin Laden, who had been fighting on behalf of the Afghans against the Soviets and went back to Saudi Arabia, was thrown out of there for demonstrating against American presence there and against the lacking of Islamic character of the Saudi regime, went to Sudan to establish training camps to fight against the West now, and then was thrown out of there due to Saudi and American pressure, and went back to Afghanistan as a result of the efforts of the Pakistani Army's military intelligence to put them together, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, both to help them, the Pakistanis, achieve their objectives. So you've asked me what I know about now. I'm trying to give you a kind of a background of all the characters now, all the players in this very moment who are meeting one with each other in some form or another, and how it plays together. This is what I would call an unholy alliance that was constituted in 1996. The Pakistanis recognize that the whole situation is becoming a real mess for them, because Pakistan is on the verge in some ways of becoming a failed state because of the unrest in the country, the ineffectiveness of the democratic governments that preceded this latest version of the military government. And they know that a lot of the young people who were trained for fighting in Afghanistan and Kashmir, when coming back, are not pleased with what they consider to be the lack of extreme Islamic nature of their government either. So they've got their own kind of chickens coming home to roost, and they probably see this as an opportunity to reestablish control in a secular fashion over their nation.
What about the relationship between U.S. intelligence, which helped to train Osama bin Laden and other Islamic militants in Afghanistan in fighting the Soviets, along with the British intelligence and Pakistani intelligence, and their relationship with these intelligence organizations today?
Well, I think we need to understand that that was going on, and but I think that the primary contacts between Osama bin Laden and anything that was going on relating to this war was through the Pakistani intelligence. That's not to say that it didn't have at least some connection with our own, interests and objectives and strategies there. The thing to remember is that was a different era. In 1989, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in ignominious defeat. At Thanksgiving time that same year, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union was history. That was a different era, a different time, and you got to remember that those were the Afghans who remained behind to fight against the Soviet Union. And a lot of the others left and went to be refugees, but these people fought. And unfortunately, as I indicated earlier, those who did the fighting were unable themselves to put together a cohesive government because this was a tribal society that had worked centuries to create a social fabric, a social infrastructure. The war, the Soviet war, devastated and ruined the country. It looks like Berlin after the Second World War, even to this day. And so it became Humpty Dumpty. All those pieces fell apart, and it takes not just 1, 2, or 3 generations to put them back together, but it took Afghanistan, 2 centuries to put that together. And so into that vacuum, were coming extremist, forms of government because, unfortunately, this is a part of U.S. policy, which is an unfortunate element to this. We backed away from Afghanistan, and we're trying to help the Russians emerge from their Soviet past. That's where we put our primary focus. Not really recognizing, unfortunately, I think, that stability in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Pakistan was going to have even more of an impact on what might happen in Russia and that part of the world in the long term than just our policy there. I think we did the right thing with Russia, but we did the wrong thing with Afghanistan, and we need to be able to carry on more than one policy effectively at the same time.
Professor Thomas Guittierre, can you give us a picture of Afghanistan, for example, Kabul, and the places that people are fleeing from right now? What is it exactly, if the U.S. bombed, they would be bombing?
Well, people say that that it's possible to bomb Afghanistan back into the Stone Age. I can tell you it's already there. I lived in Kabul for 10 years myself in the 60s and 70s, and it used to be a very beautiful city and a very, very picturesque country with dramatic, vistas and everything, high mountains and beautiful little valleys. But today, Afghanistan is a ruined, skeleton of its former self. And but the thing to remember is that there are many, 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 many Afghans inside the country who would just as soon be rid of these extremist Taliban and also these foreigners on their soil. Afghans have never welcomed foreigners on their soil. So now we have, these foreigners there. They'd like to get rid of them, and there are a lot of Afghans who I'm certain will be willing to work with us to try and remove Osama bin Laden and the Taliban if they are not willing to cooperate.
Finally, what do you think at this point in terms of the Pakistani political landscape, the U.S. military operations being, I don't know if it's based in Pakistan, using the airspace, etc., in terms of how it will affect the country?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult for the Pakistanis. They've created themselves, they've helped to create a situation that is difficult for them now to live with if they're to have a tenable future as a nation state. And so we're cooperating with them. I think we need to go in this, though, with our eyes wide open, because in the past 10 years, the Pakistanis have repeatedly lied to us about their intentions in Afghanistan and their connections with Osama bin Laden and the Taliban. They have been intimate throughout this time, very intimate, and they've denied this, but it's not true. And I witnessed this firsthand as a member of the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan and subsequent trips, and it's an unfortunate thing. You have one part of the Pakistani government telling you something, and then you have the military, and particularly the military intelligence, doing something else in league with extremists in their own country and Osama bin Laden and other extremists from the Persian Gulf.
What does it mean that Afghanistan has deployed 25,000 troops, according to the Washington Post, on the Pakistan-Afghani border?
Well, I'm not sure that all those troops are Afghan. I think large numbers of them are probably Arab and certainly Pakistani, and so and one must understand, while these troops may be highly disciplined religiously, their military discipline is of another nature, and many of them, when I would meet in Afghanistan and various parts when I was there, during the UN period, didn't like to be in the military more than 6 months, and they just came home on their own. And I think it's possible for some of those to be peeled off if it appears that the situation is not very good for the Taliban at this time.
The Russian intelligence is saying that they were keeping tabs on Osama bin Laden until, well, just before the strike, and then don't have information on him. What do you think are the possibilities of, or the extensiveness of the U.S., Russian intelligence on Osama bin Laden and his whereabouts?
The intelligence apparatus that has the best knowledge of Osama bin Laden and his whereabouts right now is the Pakistani military intelligence, and they likely know where he is.
Do you think that Afghanistan will turn Osama bin Laden over with this Pakistani delegation going to ask that they do?
I think Afghans in Afghanistan would love to do that. I think the Taliban at this stage don't appear likely to want to do that. I have difficulty associating Afghanistan and Taliban together, because the Taliban really are I consider them to be an entity that really has no concept of a nation state and is not really able to think in terms of the interest of the population of Afghanistan. The leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, takes instructions only from God, and the Pakistanis and the Arabs who are surrounding him as advisors. And so I don't have a lot of faith that we'll be able to get much in the way from him. He's like those who crashed into the trade towers, probably believing that if he dies in this struggle, he'll serve as a martyr and go straight to heaven. But there are many Afghans who'd like to be able to reconstruct the country that they love so much, that has been fighting against the Soviets and now this mess for the last 10 years, who'd like to bring their country back to what at least it was before the war began, and that will take a long, long time.
What is the relationship between the Taliban and Osama bin Laden? Why do they protect him?
Because they're very dependent upon him. Most of the Taliban's fighters on the front line against the other Afghans in the country are members of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's group, and also they are also those who have been trained in his camps, in his training camps. So that's the relationship. In many ways, Osama bin Laden's military forces are stronger than those of the Afghan Taliban movement. I regret to have to tell you this. I need to go right now.
Well, I thank you very much for spending the time with us. Tomas Guittierre is Dean of International Studies and Programs at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's Director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at UNO. Tomas Guittierre spent 10 years in Afghanistan. He was with the Peace Corps. You are listening to Democracy Now! In Exile. In this program, you'll be hearing a peace vigil of thousands that took place yesterday, looking from Brooklyn at the World Trade Center, or I should say, the World Trade Center-less skyline of Lower Manhattan. It was a vigil to show support for Arab Americans and Muslims. We will also be speaking with Robert Fisk in Lebanon. He's interviewed Osama bin Laden as well. He's interviewed one of the parents of a man who has been blamed for the terror attacks in the United States. You are listening to Democracy Now! In Exile. Back in a minute. This weekend, not much luck with finding anyone alive in the rubble. It looks like somewhere around, well, more than 5,000 people continue to be, if you can use the term, entombed or incinerated by the attacks of last Tuesday, both in New York, the World Trade Center Towers attack, and the attack in Washington, D.C. on the Pentagon. We are at a firehouse, downtown community television, just below Canal Street. We spent last week, since the attacks, here because we were afraid we would not be able to come in to broadcast if we ever left the site. We are in the evacuation zone. It's loosened up a bit over the weekend. A lot of the emergency vehicles are just a block away from us on Broadway and in that area as hundreds of emergency workers continue to get rid of, in a very painstakingly slow process, the rubble to still try to find some people who might be alive. But right now, we're going to go to another borough, and that's Brooklyn, because at about 5 o'clock, thousands of people gathered at Court Street and Atlantic Avenue, the heart of the Arab American community, to show their support for Arab Americans and Muslims. Perhaps an unlikely sound that was part of this vigil as people walked from the Arab American business district to the promenade that looks out on the southern landscape of Manhattan. Used to be the World Trade Center towers, now simply smoke. An unlikely sound at this vigil was the sound of the shofar that will be heard around the country and around the world tonight for the beginning of the holiest days of the Jewish New Year, and that is Rosh Hashanah. The sound of the shofar was blown last night for the Muslims and Arab Americans and their safety.
Thank you. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله. اللهم ارحم الأموات. اللهم ارحم الأموات. اللهم ارحم الأموات. اللهم ارزق أهلهم وذويهم الصبر والسلوان وعوضهم خيرا يا رب العالمين. اللهم المجرمين فإنهم لا يعجزونك. اللهم عليك بهم جميعا فإنهم لا يعجزونك. صل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Thank you.
My name is Khadr Al-Yatim. My main concern at the church is to make sure our people are safe and they are not discriminated against and nobody is attacked because they are Arabs. Because as New Yorkers, as Americans, we are also affected by this tragedy, and we have our own losses in this tragedy. And we just try to work with the community to participate as much as we can, to offer whatever we can to the community for the healing process.
Which is your church?
It's Salam Arabic Lutheran Church in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn.
And who have you lost?
Well, we have, not directly from our church, but from our community, we have 2 people who died in the crash. Yeah. And we have a few people from our church who've been attacked because they are Arabs.
What has happened to them?
One person, some of the people went and throw eggs at his house. The other person, about 5 or 7 youth, went to his store, destroyed the sign, throw dirt on the goods he has in the store, and wrote some words, graffiti, which is insulting.
What is being done about that?
Well, we are working closely with the police and with the city council, Marty Golden, to try to bring peace and unity. And we did 2 meetings already in our church to bring the community to speak about peace and understanding and to promote this unity in our community. So we've been taking an active role to participate and help in any way we can.
You said you're Palestinian American?
Yes, I'm Palestinian Christian, yes.
What about the response in the occupied territories right now?
Well, everybody there is saddened by the attack, and I've been in very close touch with my family there, and they're still in shock. They couldn't believe it, or they still cannot believe it that this has happened.
Where does your family live?
We live in Beit Jala, which is 5 minutes north of Bethlehem.
Can you give me your phone number to be in touch with you?
74.
And your name?
Khader.
And
You need the last name? Elyat.
you're listening to the sounds of the vigil for Arab Americans and Muslims. Last question. Emma.
Yes.
What do you think of the possibility of a retaliatory attack?
Well, I think that will be so soon to speak about that, but I strongly disagree with it until we find out exactly what happened and how to deal with the situation. I do not support it at this time.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Joe Potasnik, Rabbi of Congregation Mount Sinai here in Brooklyn Heights. I purposely want to stand next to Muslims and Christians and Jews and members of all other faiths for one simple reason: because terrorism does not want us to stand together. And therefore, the most effective response here is that we of different faiths stand together.
I'm Andrew Stetner, and I'm with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And we're here today because we're shuddering that the impact of the World Trade Center attack is being felt all over the country by Arab Americans and Muslims. There have been over 200 attacks in the country, and Arab Americans say they're increasing. And we're very afraid, and we're afraid that the lives of those who are lost will be taken in vain by bombings throughout the Islamic world. So we're here with a lot of fear, and we're really shuddering at the impact, but confident and hopeful that there's beginning to be a popular movement that is beginning to say this is not the way to mourn just an incredibly terrible loss that we're all bearing.
Salam, shalom, come sing with us. Peace, salam, shalom. 3 easy words. Peace, salam, shalom. Come sing with us. Peace, salam, shalom. 3 easy words. Peace, salam, shalom. Come sing with us. Peace, salam, shalom. Come sing with us. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom. Peace, salam, shalom.
My name is Purvi Shah. I'm a board member at Saki for South Asian Women, and I'm here today, one, because one of my friends was in 2 World Trade Center and she is still missing, Swarna Chalasani, who is a longtime Saki volunteer. I'm also here today not only to condemn the terrorist attack and to grieve, but also because there has been a lot of anti-Muslim and anti-Arab American violence in the city and across the nation, and we wanted to condemn both the violence of the terrorist attacks and the violence and hate crimes that are occurring now. Swarna worked as a part of Saki for peace in her everyday life. She worked with battered women to advocate for peace, to advocate their health and safety, and I think it's so sad to see that the outcome of this terrorist attack has been to create more violence in our lives instead of more peace. And so we wanted to share with other people of all faiths, all ethnicities, all cultural backgrounds, a stand for peace, and to really question what we're doing here. What does it mean to retaliate? What does it mean to have a war on terrorism? What does it mean to have a war on terrorism when you're going to terrorize innocent people? And to really raise those questions as ordinary citizens, because I think right now it seems like we're helpless. It seems like there's not much we can do, but it's really our voices that matter and count right now. So that's part of why we came here today.
What do you think of the media coverage of the attack and the aftermath?
I think, I saw the buildings fall from my Brooklyn window, and I've been consistently re-traumatized by seeing that image played over and over again, especially having a friend who is missing. It's a traumatic scene to see continuously the buildings fall and all the mayhem. I wish the media would focus on a lot of the healing and grieving and energy that people are putting into making a healing ceremony or a peace out of this terrible tragedy that's happened. And I also feel that the media has not been very critical of the president's warmongering stance on this whole situation. I feel like the media has fed into his approach of dealing with this situation by continuously displaying these scenes of grieving and heightening the tragedy in that way. Whereas I feel like BBC World and other media in other countries have noticed the ways in which this tragic attack does not come out of nowhere, that it has a historical series of precedents. The media has covered the ways in which Israeli tanks are now in the West Bank, and the other kinds of after effects that this tragedy has had. In fact, terrorism wants to splinter us apart, and we are helping that to happen. We are helping to fuel the war that bin Laden would want us to have. And I feel it's the media's responsibility, as well as the responsibility of everyday people and our government who are refusing to act in peaceful ways, to create other options and to of course bring these terrorists to justice, but also not to produce more injustice in the world. I think one of the religious leaders at the national prayer ceremony said it so well. He said that we do not want to become the evil that we condemn, and I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
Hi, this is Tom Tomorrow. We came down here to express our belief, our fervent hope that Arab Americans do not become a target of bigotry and hatred as a result of the terrible thing that we've all seen.
I'm sorry I haven't seen if you've done any cartoons recently, have you?
Yeah, I've done a couple. I'm trying not to... this is going to be a very polarizing time, a very divisive time, and I'm trying... I think it's important to try to have a dialogue. I don't want to only preach to the choir at this point. So I did what I thought was very reasonable, very sort of low-key, just talking about how my sense that retaliation might lead to something worse, how we don't want to use this as an excuse to target Arab Americans, and how we don't want to see this used as an excuse to pull civil liberties. And even just that very, very, very measured thing has just gotten me a ton of very, very hateful email, people effectively comparing my work as a cartoonist in the newspaper with the act of the people who did this thing to us. And I'm just worried. I'm very worried about what's going to happen, but I'm worried that we're headed into a very divisive time, and I don't want to see it, and I don't know how to stop it, because people's immediate reaction is to, you know, is to gather together in the fort, and any voice of dissent whatsoever is sedition, is treasonous. And in fact, anyone is appalled by this, and certainly any decent thinking person believes that the people who did this should be brought to justice. There are just some of us who don't want to see the slaughter of innocent civilians responded to by slaughtering more innocent civilians. But I'm not even sure if we're I'm not even sure if you're going to be able to say that anymore. I'm not even sure if anyone's going to listen. The moment you suggest that there's any other course of action than a hardcore military strike, people just shut down. They won't listen. And I think on the left and the right, we've really all got to take a deep breath and listen to each other, because we are all Americans here. Nobody wanted this to happen. Nobody believed we should see this terrible destruction, this terrible loss of life. We just, in this democracy, we are just coming at this from different points of view, and we've got to continue to be able to talk that out openly in this democracy, or else these guys have won. And I'm just afraid we're not going to. I'm afraid that's not going to happen.
Where can people see your work?
Well, I gotta say, cartoons just don't seem awfully important right now. But if you really don't have anything better to do, you can see it at salon.com.
Cartoonist Tom Tomorrow joining thousands of others last night at a sunset vigil in Brooklyn, in the heart of the Arab American community. It was a vigil to call for the protection of Arab Americans and Muslims in this country in the face of rising attacks. In fact, this news has just flashed over the BBC website that an Afghani taxi driver was left paralyzed in London after a racist attack. You are listening to Democracy Now! In Exile. When we return, we will go to Europe to find out reaction there to the preparations for an imminent attack and to the attacks that took place last week. We're doing a 2-hour special today, and for those who are staying with us, Robert Fisk will be joining us from Lebanon to talk about his interview with Osama bin Laden, and we'll also be talking about the legislation, the counterterrorism legislation that is rapidly being introduced into the House and the Senate that would severely curtail civil liberties and increase surveillance. Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights will be joining us, and we'll be continuing to go into the streets to a rally that took place this weekend in Union Square Park. It was a rally to remember the dead, to give hope to those whose loved ones have not yet been found, and to speak out against war. Stay with us. You are listening to Democracy Now! In Exile, Ground Zero Radio, just blocks from where the World Trade Center once was and where hundreds of people continue to comb through the rubble, shipping it away. Tons of stones and cement, steel have been taken away over the weekend as the emergency personnel attempt slowly but surely to find at least a living person. It has been a very, very difficult last few days. While the weather has been good, there has been very little hope or finding of people in the rubble. This piece by Ron Howell in Newsday. As New York struggled to return to its bustling self, preparing for the reopening today of public schools and the stock exchange, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani invoked the memory of Winston Churchill, who 60 years ago rallied the British as they withstood Nazi air attacks on London. Just as Londoners had been heroes, Giuliani said, so too are New Yorkers. He said, we're not the first people that have gone through being attacked, pointing out that he's been reading the book 5 Days in London for Courage over the past week. And in the New York Times today, in a piece by Suzanne Daly, after offering expressions of support immediately following this week's attacks on the United States, European allies are showing signs of backpedaling. The NATO allies have said they could support some military action, but now the caveats are beginning to roll in, making clear that the terror attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon will not translate into an unconditional writ for American retaliation. Particularly as talk in Washington has grown tougher, the allies have begun showing signs they want a carefully thought-out plan to combat terrorism, not a burst of military might that turns out to be brutal and ineffective. Many politicians have begun distancing themselves from Washington's saber-rattling. While President Bush has repeatedly described the terror attacks as acts of war, European officials are going out of their way to avoid such language. On a radio program, the Belgian Foreign Minister, Louis Michel, said the European Union is on watch and mobilized, but he added, we are not at war. In France, Prime Minister Lionel Jospin has cautioned there is no, quote, war against Islam or the Arab Muslim world. Moreover, he signaled that France would not automatically support military action, saying our humane, political, and functional solidarity with the United States does not deprive us of our sovereignty and freedom to make up our own minds. We turn now to Paris, France, to Imogen Lam, who is a reporter with RFI, Radio France International. Welcome to Democracy Now! In Exile.
Thank you. Hello.
It's good to have you with us. Before we talk about Afghanistan, where you were in April, let's talk about France and the political climate there after the attacks on the United States.
I think France, like the other European countries, has reacted with full support for the United States in these very, very difficult times that it's going through, but as you say, has been cautious in the use of the word war. Europe feels that it has to support the United States in these times, but it doesn't want to go so far as to speak of an all-out war in progress here.
What about the French left right now, the whole political spectrum? What kind of response?
What's extraordinary is that reading both right and left-wing newspapers, much of the commentary is very similar in expressing its support for the American people, at the same time pointing out that American foreign policy could very much be responsible in a way for what has happened because of the irresponsible attitude of American leaders in the past few years, to take just Afghanistan as an example, because of the involvement of the American government in that country over the years and the support that it gave the Taliban in the early years. And in this kind of reaction, there is very little difference, strangely enough, between right and left.
Imogen Lam, you have spent a good deal of time in Afghanistan, most recently in April. Can you talk about Afghanistan today, Afghanistan in the year 2001?
Afghanistan is a country that has been at war for over 20 years. It's a country that's almost totally destroyed. It has few or no infrastructures, and its people have suffered tremendously and are continuing to suffer terrible, unimaginable hardships. And the very thought that they're going to suffer even more in the days or weeks to come is absolutely frightening.
Can you talk about the people there, the people and the government?
Well, I think one has to be very careful when you talk about Afghanistan, you talk about the Taliban. The vast majority of people in Afghanistan are not Taliban. They are Afghan civilians who are suffering an extremely difficult situation. They're people who really have very little left. Many have been forced to flee their homes, forced to flee the country because of war, because of drought, because of famine in the past few years. I was in the center of the country, one of the parts worst hit by drought earlier this year. It hadn't rained there in 3 years, and I spoke to families who'd been forced to flee their villages because of the drought, who had nowhere to go to, who had very little food to eat. I went through villages, towns where there was no more meat available, no eggs, no dairy products, no flour. Afghanistan used to be a big wheat-producing country. It used to export wheat to its neighbors. And in towns, the situation is little better. In Kabul itself, the people are struggling to survive. 1/4 of the population is surviving thanks to handouts by international organizations, particularly thanks to subsidized bread. I met many people who live on bread and tea, black tea with no sugar, and that's all that these families are living on right now.
Imogen Lam, what about the women of Afghanistan? An issue that we hear something about. There's an organization, RAWA, the Radical Association of Afghani Women, that we get information from on the web. We have done interviews with them in exile in Pakistan, but there is not a tremendous amount known about what they are going through today.
Well, I can talk to you about the women of Kabul. I spent 2 weeks in Kabul, and I met many women in their homes. Although I wasn't allowed to, women are not allowed to receive foreigners in their homes. Their life is extremely difficult. They're not allowed to go out without a male member of their family to accompany them. They have no work because they're not allowed to work. For many, their husbands are unemployed because unemployment is rife. Since the Taliban took over Kabul, many civil servants were sacked. People don't have jobs. So the women's situation is very difficult. They're having to feed their families with very little money coming in. Many women have sold all their possessions, which is why in the first few months they were able to eat, to buy food. And now I spoke to women who say, we have sold everything. We have borrowed from our neighbors. Our neighbors have nothing anymore. They cannot lend us anything. They've no more food either. We've nothing more to sell. And their situation is really, really very, very serious. Many have fled. Those who could have fled the city have fled abroad, but many more cannot flee. And they're living in their homes, no chance of an education, no chance of a job, no proper food, not enough food to give their children, very little medical treatment at their disposal. So you can imagine what these women are going through right now.
All over the world, it is the case that with war, it is overwhelmingly civilians who suffer the brutality of war. When it comes to Kabul, what would be your picture of what would happen if it's bombed?
Half the city is already completely bombed and destroyed. Many people live in the ruins of the city. For those who do have homes, I can't begin to imagine the devastation because, as you say, it's the civilians who are hit first and foremost in any kind of bombing attack. I imagine that the authorities, most of the Taliban authorities, will have sought shelter, will have taken care of themselves and their families. That leaves the vast majority of the people in Kabul, the civilians, who've nowhere to run to, who've no bomb shelters to go to, and who are going to be totally devastated. Those who are injured will have very little treatment, very little medicine at their disposal. Although there are some hospitals working in Kabul, most of those won't accept women for treatment, for example, or girls. So any girls or women who are injured in any attack there's only one hospital in the city where they can turn to. That treatment was been run with the help of international aid organizations. Those expatriate workers have had to leave the country, so it's unclear at this stage how much aid will remain in the city for people in need of help.
Imogen Lam, how much discussion in France is there now of the involvement of the United States in the training, for example, of Osama bin Laden, the CIA's training of him when he came originally to Afghanistan, and also the fact that the U.S. just recently gave $40 million to the Taliban regime, ostensibly for the so-called war on drugs?
Everybody's aware of it. There's a lot on that in the newspapers. People are talking about it. And as I said earlier, people are very supportive of the American people at this time. at the same time, they are talking about the responsibility of successive American governments, and they are saying that the United States can no longer continue this kind of support of Islamic fundamentalist movements. It cannot continue as it has done up till now its foreign policies, and it's got to reevaluate its position in the world and its involvement in world politics.
Is there a sense that the U.S. will clearly be attacking soon, not exactly clear where, and do people in France feel themselves getting on a war footing?
Most people think that the United States is definitely going to attack. Many think that it will be in Afghanistan. They don't really know who they're going to attack there or how they're going to find Osama bin Laden, for example. They're not so clear about French involvement. France has expressed support, but it's funny when you talk to the older French men and women, they remember the Americans' role at the end of the Second World War. They remember when the Americans landed in France, and they say the Americans helped us. It's for us to help them now. So I imagine they're thinking more on the terms of military help. The younger people, not necessarily. They think we should be supportive, but not necessarily militarily.
Well, Imogen Lam, I want to thank you very much for being with us from Paris, France, just having returned in April from Afghanistan. And that does it for today's program. For those of you who are staying with us for our second hour, we'll be interviewing Robert Fisk in Beirut, Lebanon. He's interviewed Osama bin Laden, as well as one of the parents of one of the men believed to have been part of the attack on one of the planes that went into the World Trade Center and Pentagon. We'll also be hearing from a peace vigil that took place this weekend in New York. Democracy Now! In Exile is produced by Chris Abrams, Brad Simpson, and Miranda Kennedy. Anthony Sloan is our music maestro, and engineer Errol Maitland at WBIX.org, our spiritual and technical director. Special thanks to Chase Pearson, Tony Riddle, Rick Youngers. We're broadcasting on Channel 34 at Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and our camera person is Karen Ranucci. Thank you to the Pacifica stations, especially KPFA and KFCF in Fresno, and of course all of our affiliate stations around the country. We are Pacifica. Encourage your Pacifica station to tune in to Democracy Now! In Exile. You can also hear us at www.webactive.com. We're broadcasting from Downtown Community Television. We're in the historic firehouse of Engine 31 in Chinatown. In Exile from the embattled studios of WBAI, from the studios of The Band and the Fired, I'm Amy. From Ground Zero Radio, this is Democracy Now! In Exile.
Without exception, we are horrified at the pain, fear, and death inflicted on thousands of people in New York and elsewhere by these acts. We are deeply concerned about the social and political aftermath of this event. We fear an upsurge of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racism, and we have already seen the signs in the media and in conversations on the street.
As the world continues to mourn thousands killed in last week's World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks, they also plead for peace. We'll go to the vigils of New York and to journalist Robert Fisk in Lebanon, longtime Middle East correspondent, about his interview with Osama bin Laden. All that and more coming up on Democracy Now! In Exile. Welcome to Democracy Now! In Exile, Resistance Radio, broadcasting just blocks from where thousands of emergency workers continue to comb through the rubble of what once was the World Trade Center. Bush administration officials said yesterday they're considering lifting a 25-year-old ban on U.S. involvement in foreign assassinations and loosening restrictions on FBI surveillance. They said the Justice Department plans to send a wide-ranging set of proposals to Capitol Capitol Hill this week that would include more power to conduct wiretaps, detain foreigners, and track money laundering cases. Vice President Cheney said yesterday that CIA field officers may be allowed to recruit and pay overseas agents linked to terrorist groups and human rights abuses, saying it's necessary to infiltrate suspected terrorist cells. In addition, Florida Democratic Senator Bob Graham, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, says he'll introduce a counterterrorism package next week that'll create a counterterrorism czar inside the White House and establish authority for the CIA to recruit unsavory agents. And Secretary of State Colin Powell says the administration is reviewing an executive order issued by President Gerald Ford in 1976 that bans U.S. personnel from engaging in or conspiring to engage in assassinations. Some intelligence and terrorism experts have advocated assassinating Osama bin Laden. The exiled Saudi millionaire who lives in hiding in Afghanistan has been named the prime suspect in last week's attacks. The Senate last week approved legislation that would make it easier for the FBI to get warrants for electronic surveillance of computer transmissions. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Patrick Leahy, a Vermont Democrat, called the measure overly broad and an encroachment on civil liberties. He said, quote, "We have to be careful that in our horror and revulsion over this horrendous and terrible act, we don't start giving away the freedoms that make us different from terrorists." Several Democrats said many senators did not know exactly what they were voting on and supported the measure in their determination to condemn terrorism. European support for U.S.-led retaliation to last week's attacks in New York and Washington has shown signs of faltering as leaders strike a range of nuanced positions, some at odds with Washington's. Although the European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Javier Solana, called for a grand international coalition to fight against this plague of terrorism, leading politicians in France, Germany, and Italy expressed reservations about the U.S. response, though German leaders are themselves divided. The term war is inappropriate, said Italian Defense Minister Antonio Martino, echoing views expressed across Italy's spectrum. Germany's President Johannes Rau doubted that his country's troops would take part in any armed response, suggesting they would play a role in providing logistical support to NATO's response. Russian defense officials have also qualified their initial signs of solidarity with the U.S. regarding military action. The defense minister ruled out launching attacks on Afghanistan from bordering former Soviet republics, and the chief of staff said Russia would not participate militarily. Spain, led like the U.S. by a right-wing administration, has given one of the strongest signals of support. This just in, an Afghani taxi driver was left paralyzed after a racist attack in London. And 4 people are now being held as, quote, material witnesses as the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation continues its huge investigation into Tuesday's attacks. Details of the latest arrests are not clear, but it's understood they relate specifically to the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. In addition to the arrest, 25 other people have been taken into custody on alleged immigration violations. The FBI has about 4,000 agents working on 40,000 leads. Racist attacks against Arabs or people of Arabic descent have increased around the world. In addition to the Afghan taxi driver being reported by BBC to have been paralyzed after an attack in London. Over the last few days in New York, a caller threatened to harm hundreds of students in an Islamic school. In Texas, a mosque was firebombed. In Wyoming, an angry group of shoppers chased a woman and her children from a Walmart. In Bridgeview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, police stopped 300 marchers as they tried to march on a mosque. Around the nation, Muslim and Arab communities say they are being targeted, and the anger is nationwide. India said yesterday it's asked the United States to take steps to prevent attacks on Sikhs living in the United States after last week's attacks on Washington and New York. You are listening to Ground Zero Radio, Democracy Now! In Exile. I'm Amy Goodman. That was Paths of Victory, the Broadside Singers with David Cohen and Pete Seeger. This is a piece by Robert Fisk from the 1998 issue of The Nation magazine, as he begins, "The last time I saw Osama bin Laden was in a tent on a mountaintop camp in Afghanistan last year. A few meters away was a 25-foot-high air raid shelter cut into the rock, a relic of bin Laden's days fighting the Soviet army, but bomb-proof against even a cruise missile. Bin Laden had entered the tent in his white Saudi robes, shaken hands with me, and sat cross-legged on the rug." Robert Fisk joins us now from Beirut. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Robert.
Hi, Amy.
It's good to have you with us. So tell us about that meeting you had with him.
Yeah, well, the meeting was for my own newspaper, the London Independent, not for The Nation, though I did write a piece for The Nation. It was looking back on it, I suppose it was a prescient meeting, although at the time, of course, it was interesting enough. We knew that the Americans were fingering bin Laden as the man behind attacks on American troops in the Gulf. We knew that bin Laden was being accused of running an international network of World Terror Inc., as the sobriquet went from the State Department and, of course, Time magazine. And it was a strange meeting in that it took me hours to get up this mountainside with guards, his armed guards, up a road which he himself had built with his own construction equipment during the Afghan-Russian war, so the Mujahideen could get up the mountainsides and could physically get high enough to fire British blowpipe missiles at Russian MiG fighters. It was a journey. The clouds were below us. There were waterfalls frozen above us. The Toyota Jeep screeching on the scree on the side of the mountainside. At one point, I thought we were in great danger of not surviving this. But at one point, in fact, the driver, who was a Tunisian fighter for bin Laden, turned and said, "Toyota is good for jihad." In other words, Toyotas are good for holy war. But anyway, we got up the top of the mountain, and I was taken to a tent next to the air raid shelter. And I waited in there, and after about an hour, bin Laden walked in very humble white Saudi robes. I noticed on the latest videotape he's wearing some kind of gold embroidered gold cloth, which seems to me as if something's changed in him. But anyway, in those days he was still the same. He had a slight infirmity in the leg. I kind of gave him a small limp. But I still have my notes scribbled in the frozen darkness with an oil lamp sputtering between us. I've got the quotes which I thought were most frightening. He started off with the old cliche, "I'm not against the American people, only their government." Decades of dictatorship out here, of course, have persuaded many Muslims of the region that governments don't represent their people. And I tried to explain to bin Laden that this was not so in the West, that the American people, against whom he supposedly had no argument, regarded their government as their elected representatives. He didn't say much to this, merely the observation that we are still at the beginning of our military action against the American forces. He was talking there about American forces in the Gulf, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And then later on, there was a much more disturbing remark, or certainly disturbing in the light of what happened last week. And this does not mean he was responsible, but it obviously raises the question in my mind. He said, "We believe that God used our holy war in Afghanistan to destroy the Russian army and the Soviet Union. He said, we did this from the top of the very mountain on which you are sitting, Mr. Robert. And now we ask God to use us one more time to do the same to America, to make it a shadow of itself. We also believe that our battle against America is much simpler than our battle against the Russians." And he went on to say that the reason for this was that some of his men had fought the Americans in Somalia. He meant the doomed UN mission to Somalia. And he said that gave them the impression that he said, "Our men were surprised at the collapse of American morale in Somalia. This convinced us that the Americans are a paper tiger." Well, in the coming days, weeks, or months, he may change that view of the Americans being a paper tiger, but that's what he said to me at the time.
This is Robert Fisk describing his interview with Osama bin Laden. And this was in, when, 1997?
March the 26th, 1997 is the date on my notes.
Mm-hmm. And how difficult was it to make contact with him and to reach him?
Well, you have to understand it wasn't that simple. I had first met him in Sudan in 1994 when he was already being fingered by the United States, but not for anything particularly specific. And at the time, he was using his own road construction equipment, the same bulldozers and earth movers he'd had in Afghanistan, to build a road for a small village, which would connect that village to the main highway between Port Sudan and Khartoum. And when I arrived, there were sort of festivities going on, and villagers were dancing and slaughtering sheep in his honor. And when I approached him, I think he thought I was going to ask him about World Terror, Inc. But in fact, I was more interested in hearing about his life. This, of course, is 1994 we're talking about, his life when he was fighting the Russians. He was wounded 6 times. He was undoubtedly a brave man at war. He didn't really want to talk about himself, but I pushed him, and he did. And he talked about how one day, in an attack on a Russian firebase in Nangarhar province, that's around the area of Jalalabad in southeastern Afghanistan, a shell, probably a mortar shell from the Russians, landed at his feet. And in the few milliseconds he waited to die, he said he felt this great tranquility come over him, a great calmness of spirit, which he associated with his religion. And then, no doubt the Americans today would wish it otherwise, the shell did not explode. But it obviously was a considerable religious experience for him, and I was interested to see what was making him what he was, and I think the war did it. There's no doubt. You've just heard the quotation from him about how he moved from the war against the Russians, whom, of course, he regarded as a corrupt Western power. From the Saudi-Afghan point of view, that's what they were, to the war against America. And anyway, I know that he secured a copy of the newspaper later on, and apparently he thought it was fair. He expected it was all going to be about World Terror, Inc. And so later, when I was in Afghanistan, I was able to make contact. And after many weeks, I received a boy came to a hotel in a ruined city and said to me, Mr. Osama will see you. I was then told to be ready the next day when someone rattled a car key on my bedroom window. And I was taken out to a road where 6 young men, not that young actually, with rocket launchers and rifles were sitting on an open-top truck. I was a bit worried there might be Pakistani security or intelligence. This was inside Afghanistan, of course. And they took me off across wastelands. We went through an extraordinary, we must have gone hundreds of miles through deserted areas. There were whole Afghan villages bombed to pieces by the Russians, burned out tanks, naked babies playing in the ruins. A huge number of areas which no one went into because of mines. There are 10 million mines in Afghanistan today. 10 million. That's a tenth of all the world's mines. Mr. Bush will no doubt be thinking of that if he sends his soldiers in there. And eventually, in the evening, we came across a sort of orchard and a small stream, and I waded through the stream to the other side. And out of a mud hut with a lamp burning in it came bin Laden. And he said, how was I? And I said, I've come a long way. And he said, well, I've come a long way too. He'd obviously been traveling from the far end of Afghanistan to meet me. And there we had another conversation which very much revolved around his desire to destroy the Arab pro-American regimes, not the countries, but the regimes. First and foremost, the Saudi regime, which he regarded as corrupt. At one point he pulled out a little notebook and started reading off all the millions of dollars in statistics which he believed various Saudi princes had misappropriated from the people's money, of the people's money. And he then went on talking about Egypt and about Jordan, both of whom he saw as being basically pro-Western regimes whose governments repressed their own people with torture. He spoke very movingly, or at least I thought so at the time, of course I might not think so now, of the tens of thousands of children who were suffering under UN sanctions. There weren't as many dead then, of course, as there are now in Iraq. He hated Saddam and made that very clear to me. I tried to draw him a little bit on his past. All he could remember, he'd visited London once. He could remember as a little boy of 5 or 6 looking out the window of a hotel, no doubt a very luxurious hotel because his family are multi-billionaires, and seeing red London buses. But that was really the only contact he had left from the West that he chose to talk about. And he then talked over and over again about some bombs which had gone off in Al-Huba, near Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, and in Riyadh. He admitted in the last conversation we had on the top of the mountain that he knew 2 of the men involved in the bombing in Al-Huba, who had since been executed, beheaded by the Saudis. But he said, I didn't plan it. It wasn't my doing, although I wish I had had the honor to participate. That's what he said.
The bombing of the U.S. military.
Was, a bit chilling.
This is the bombing of the U.S. military.
Bombing U.S. military bases in Riyadh and Dhahran, or the Al-Hoba area of Dhahran. Yeah, 24 Americans killed in the second, I think 19 in the first. Military, of course. At that time, of course, I was still talking to a man who was talking about combating military forces, not civilians. And I also have to add, I simply do not have any proof that he is behind the, I don't think atrocities are really good enough. I think the word is crimes against humanity, which took place in New York and Washington last week. I don't have the proof, but obviously I've been thinking a lot about it, going back through my notes and reading what he said, and that phrase, a shadow of itself, about America, somehow, if you think of that and you see the World Trade Center coming down and the buildings around it, it sort of comes together in a rather chilling way. But again, that's not evidence, that's not proof.
Well, Robert Fisk, you went to Al-Marj, Lebanon, and met the family of Ziad Jarrah, who died trying to destroy the White House. Can you talk about this trip that you've just written about in The Independent?
Yeah, well, Al-Marj is a sprawling, quite well-off village in the Bekaa Valley. It's a Sunni and Christian village. It's not Shiite. It's not associated with the Hezbollah or previous suicide bombings in Lebanon of any kind. His father agreed to see me, probably because there's some knowledge there that I wrote a book about Lebanon, which is a fairly sort of compassionate account of what's happened to this country in the Civil War. And we sat for perhaps 2 hours, 2.5 hours in all. A very broken man. He'd had a heart surgery in February of this year. And he told me about a son who very definitely didn't appear to him to be an Islamist, or at least that's what he said. He said that he had a very normal life, that he'd gone off 5 years ago to a university in eastern Germany, the eastern part of the modern Germany, to study mechanical engineering, and then had moved to Bochum, Hamburg, to study aeronautical engineering. He wanted to be a pilot. The father regularly sent him quite large amounts of money. He bought a private home for himself in Germany. He had a girlfriend, a Turkish girlfriend called Asla, whom he lived with in Germany. And he enjoyed nightclubs, and he drank alcohol. He came home, he would go out for a drink with friends. So this was not like the men around bin Laden, who would never dream of smoking, let alone touching alcohol, who would get out of their vehicles in minefields and pray 5 times a day, as I saw them do in front of me in Afghanistan. His girlfriend 18 months ago, so his uncle, this is his uncle Jamal, who was sitting close to Samir, the father, told me, his girlfriend 18 months ago reported him missing and was worried that he had gone for 5 weeks to Afghanistan. And I understand, though the family did not admit this to me, that they contacted someone in Peshawar to try and get him out if he was there. The family now claim officially that, in fact, it turned out he said he was just changing universities from eastern Germany to Hamburg and hadn't been in touch during that period. Though I have to admit I find that very strange, since, not to tell you the girl you're living with for 5 weeks where you are, when all you're doing is transferring from one academic institution to another, seems very peculiar to me. The boy came home in February when the father, Ziad Jarrah, came home in February of this year when the father had his open heart surgery, and was with him every day in the hospital, fetching things, bringing things, looking after his mother and his 2 sisters. He was an only son, so he mattered a lot to the family and mattered a lot to the father, especially in this part of the world. He was the man who was going to carry on the father's name. His full name, you see, was Ziad Samir Jarrah, taking his father's name as his middle name, as many of us do in the West. Anyway, in the summer, when he was back in America, his girlfriend, Asla, said she wanted to come to Lebanon to meet his family, and he said he was too busy to come. He was very sorry, but the girl came on her own. She wanted to meet her future in-laws, which again I thought was strange. What young man in love with a young woman and was going to marry her would not want to travel with her on her first visit to meet her future family, her Lebanese side of her family, in other words, her future mother and father-in-law. 2 days before the planes were hijacked, Ziad Jarrah rang his father to thank him for a money order of $2,000, which Samir, the father, had sent him. I said to the father, that was a lot of money. He said, well, he had a girlfriend to look after, he had a house to look after in Germany, a private house, he had to look after his tuition fees. I obviously wondered whether that $2,000 was buying airline tickets. I asked what he was doing on the flight to California, and they said, oh, he must have been just a passenger. I said, did he tell you he was going to California? No, he did not. So I said, isn't that a bit strange? He rings you to thank you for the money, and he doesn't mention in 2 days' time he's going on a 2,000-mile, however the distance is across the states journey. He's going on holiday, traveling with friends, perhaps. Mohammed Atta, the Egyptian involved in one of the two planes, the pilot of one of the two planes that hit the World Trade Center, was at the same university at the same time with him. And we believe that the two of the three other men who were on this flight, which went to Pennsylvania and crashed in the ground, with apparently Ziad Jarrah at the controls, were also staying with him at one point in Germany. So very strong circumstantial evidence to suggest he was not just a passenger, not just a tourist or another hijacked passenger. Now, since then, I've understood from security sources here in Lebanon that he did, in fact, go to Afghanistan 18 months ago, just before he went to America, and spent 40 days there. And when he came back, his neighbors were surprised to see he had a beard. Now, I know no more than that, and the family, I have to say in fairness, say that that is not true, that he did not go to Afghanistan. They don't believe it. But the hole in the story, if you can use that phrase for me, is if he's one of bin Laden's men, how come the booze? How come the women? How come the nightclubs? It doesn't come in parallel with what I saw in Afghanistan. And I met a lot of bin Laden's fighters, Algerian GIA men, Egyptians, Syrians, Gulf Arabs, Palestinians. They would never have behaved like that. The only possible, I suppose, thought that would go through one's mind is that some kind of special dispensation was given on the grounds that you've got to seem like a Westerner. If you behave like a very conservative Islamist, American intelligence operatives could start to get suspicious. Now, I don't know. That's purely a guess. I have speculation. I have no knowledge of it. But clearly there is a hole in the story there. It's inexplicable that one of bin Laden's men, if that's what he was, should be behaving like any ordinary Western man and breaking an awful lot of the rules of strict Islam.
Robert Fisk is our guest, speaking to us from Beirut, Lebanon, has just come from interviewing the family of Ziad Jarrah, who died trying to destroy the White House. His piece begins when Ziad Jarrah climbed aboard United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco. Was he planning to holiday in California or to destroy the White House? The United States says the latter. His family begs visitors and friends to believe in his innocence. His father, Samir, sat beside Robert Fisk yesterday afternoon and opened his palms in that gesture of innocence, which is also a form of special pleading, Robert Fisk writes. So you have him buying these air tickets for the Boeing 757 flight to California. The other three men have been named as hijackers of flight UA-93, Ahmed Al-Haznawi, Ahmed Al-Nami, and Saeed Al-Ghamdi. And if two of them live with Ziad in Germany, his guilt seemed even more certain, you write, when it was revealed that one of his fellow students was Mohammed Atta, the Egyptian-born pilot who crashed American Airlines flight AA-11 into the World Trade Center on Tuesday morning. At this point, you also describe the mosque in the village of his family.
Yes. Well, I've never seen such a massive mosque for such a small village, though I have to say that all the villagers said that he was never seen going there. He didn't pray 5 times a day. It's also a Christian village. I just noted, because I thought that it was extraordinary that such a huge mosque should be there. I mean, it's a towering construction with 2 huge minarets, and we're talking about a village of maybe 3,000-4,000 people only. In not a wealthy part of the Bekaa, although the village itself has quite a lot of money. His father's well educated. In fact, the family as a whole, cousins and uncles, speak, many of them, English with American accents. They've lived in the States. They're very westernized. They speak pretty good English, quite good anyway. So, you know, again, the mosque doesn't cure the hole in the story, so to speak. I have to say that whether that money that the father sent, or which he thanked the father for 2 days before the hijackings, was used on air tickets, I don't know. But obviously, that was a question that came into my mind. If you remember the mobile phone calls, those terribly sad calls that were made from that flight before it crashed in Pennsylvania, one of the men who got through to his wife described the 4 men as having red headbands. Now that is more like an Islamist hijack. But, you know, it comes back to the thing, why would a guy who has an attractive girlfriend who's going to marry, who enjoys nightclubs, who goes drinking, set off to kill himself and everyone on the plane? a person who enjoys the material things of life would not normally do that. But maybe there was something we don't know about the makeup of that person, or the other 19 people or 18 people involved in this. It was a mass suicide as well as a massacre of atrocious proportions, remember. So I came away troubled, but obviously a little bit convinced that the son was indeed one of the hijackers, but that he was bin Laden's man, I would doubt totally, had it not been for the fact that I am certain he did go to Afghanistan for 40 days.
Well, you raise an interesting question that people have to ask when it comes to all information, and it has to do with skepticism. How do we know? I mean, Osama bin Laden was first named by Colin Powell, then by President Bush as the prime suspect in this case. Yep. In terms of evidence that's been presented to the public, at least, it is not clear at all why that connection has been made.
Well, there's a number of questions that obviously come to mind. First of all, the U.S. Department of Justice list of would-be hijackers or actual hijackers spells Jarrahi's name wrongly. It puts an I on it. It's Jarrah, and they spelled it Jarrahi, which is a bit sloppy, unless perhaps he had a passport that was spelt wrong. We know that at the beginning they named one of the hijackers as Abdul Rahman al-Omari, and he was stated by the U.S. authorities to be a Saudi pilot and a father of 4. Now, I've got the list in front of me. I'm just looking up Omari on here, and he is definitely listed as one of the men on Flight 11. This is the World Trade Center first aircraft to hit, piloted by Mohammed Atta. But in the later version of the list, his name has changed from Abdul Rahman to Abdulaziz al-Omari. And much more disturbingly, this Mr. al-Omari does indeed exist, but he is very much alive, very upset, and living in Jeddah with his 4 children, and he is a Saudi pilot. In fact, on Saturday, I gather, he went to the U.S. consulate in Jeddah and asked to point out, 1, that he wasn't a hijacker, and 2, that he wasn't dead but alive. The U.S. authorities have not yet been able to explain this. Of course, it is possible that he and perhaps someone else were using the identities of living people, of other living people. A lot of the guys who were training in Florida were saying, we are sponsored by Saudi Airlines, which is the national airline of Saudi Arabia. But if you're going to use someone else's identity for month after month after month, I think you'll probably get, as Mr. Bush would say, smoked out. It's a dangerous thing to do. So how come that name went down the list? I don't know. But there's a lot more explaining to do. But I don't think there's much doubt that these were Arab Muslims involved. That is the most dangerous thing about the evidence insofar as nationalities and religions are concerned, of course.
And the response right now where you are in Lebanon?
Oh, clerics, Muslim clerics, both here and in Egypt and Jordan, are lining up shoulder to shoulder to condemn what they refer to as the atrocity. Mullahs, sheikhs, sayeds, you wouldn't believe, from Beirut to Tehran, sending condolences and sympathy, and of course distancing themselves from an atrocity which many millions of Arab Muslims watched live on their television screens like you did. There is, of course, genuine outrage, but it would be perhaps, the Americans like to make this out to be the Arabs are on our side, but the truth is that the Taliban, who do seem to be the shield of Osama bin Laden, have almost as many enemies in the Middle East as they do in America. You've got to remember that Iran, at the time when America was still saying that the Taliban were a stabilizing influence after the raping and looting of the various Mujahideen groups, the Taliban were being condemned by Iran as obscurantists. They called them the Black Taliban. This is when America was quite happy with the Taliban. And remember, the Taliban were creations of basically a spiritual, theological creation of the Saudis. They're Wahhabi Sunnis. And the Saudis supported them. Our friends, the Saudis, who now turn out to have some of their citizens among the hijackers, and one particular ex-citizen called Osama bin Laden. So you have a lot of people, Syed Mohammed Hossein Fadlallah, the spiritual guide to the Hezbollah, for example, the group which reinvented the art of suicide bombing against the Israeli occupation army in Lebanon, and whom Washington still blames for the kidnapping of Americans in Beirut in the 1980s. He has been saying, I quote, "No religion justifies such an action. It is not permissible to use innocent and peaceful civilians as a card to change a specific policy." He says that Muslims want to be friends with the American people. We reject violence as a means to solve problems. The Hezbollah came out with a slightly more crafty condemnation. The Hezbollah's attitude was that it regretted the loss of innocent lives in the United States, but it warned America not to take advantage of the atrocities to practice, as it put it, to practice all sorts of aggression and terrorism under the pretext of fighting aggression and terrorism. So, by and large, there doesn't seem to be any religious personage in the Middle East of any senior kind, anyway, who has not condemned this with various degrees. They've certainly been harsher in their condemnation than the Chinese have. But as I say, having said that, that is, there are various. On the one hand, the Arabs realize that the constant repetition of the same piece of videotape of Palestinians celebrating these appalling events has done them immense harm. They're also very much aware of the danger that Israel will use these events and the world's distraction to take more territory back from the Palestinians. Indeed, that seems to have been happening in the last 24 hours. They are aware that Mr. Ariel Sharon, the Israeli Prime Minister, has been saying that Yasser Arafat is his bin Laden. And of course, there is a certain danger here. Mr. Sharon has already said he wants Israel to sign up to Mr. Bush's war on world terror. Well, if Israel does sign up and the Palestinians go on resisting occupation, they will, by extension, be on the side of world terror because they're fighting the Israelis. So there's an awful lot of political, indeed, military dangers in the Middle East because of this. But as I say, there's no one out here who's come out and said this was a good thing or this should be supported. So I think that in a sense most Arab Muslim nations, all of them really, have a clean bill of health as far as the Americans are concerned. But contrary to what Mr. Bush thinks, I don't think they're going to give them an awful lot of support when it comes to more military action against Muslims.
And the Israeli Prime Minister has called off talks with Yasser Arafat, between Arafat and Shimon Peres. There's also a question about the legitimacy of the videotape of the Palestinians who were supposedly celebrating. On the one hand, CNN absolutely vouches for it. This was in Nablus. I think questions have been raised by a Brazilian academic or filmmaker who said that this was footage from the Persian Gulf War. Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't, but I'll be quite honest with you. I've gone through the various excuses for Arab misbehavior before, and I probably go along with CNN, though, as you know from the past, it's my least favorite television channel. There were demonstrations in Ramallah. There was a demonstration that took place in East Jerusalem. It was filmed. Here in Lebanon, in the Ain al-Helwi camp, there was about an hour of demonstrations of young men firing in the air to celebrate. This was filmed by a film crew who are friends of mine, Lebanese Arab film crew. Until an hour later they were told to stop and some kind of order was restored. So whether one tiny bit of film is in question by a Brazilian cameraman is not the point. The demonstrations took place. The issue is whether the constant repetition over 24 hours on the television stations didn't give a totally distorted view of the Arab response.
I think it was the Brazilian filmmaker himself who said that that was his footage. He pulled out the old footage, exactly the same kids.
Well, fine, but I've seen 5 different bits of footage, and the footage in Lebanon is certainly genuine, and the same applies to the footage in East Jerusalem.
Finally, Osama bin Laden being located through sophisticated U.S. surveillance, British surveillance, Pakistani surveillance. Do you think they know where he is right now?
No, not at all. Look, over and over again, we've been told about the enormous sophistication of the intercepts and the surveillance and the satellite pictures and so on. So why have they not got bin Laden till now? They were after him when I first met him in 1994. And then they were after him in 1996 when I met him. Then they were after him in 1997. If they have all this information, why didn't they use it? I'm sure they have bits and pieces. But you see, the problem is that the Americans are blind on the ground. They don't have, I love these phrases, human intelligence on the ground in Afghanistan. Their one friend there, Shah Massoud, the guerrilla leader who was fighting the Taliban, was killed by 2 Arab suicide bombers just before the attacks took place in America.
Last Sunday
killed.
It's
a very, I'm sorry?
Last Sunday killed.
Yeah, that's right. Indeed, one of the suspicions that went through my mind, Amy, and I repeat, I have absolutely no proof, was to say, was his death the equivalent of a code word for the events to take place in America? Were those people told, wait until a leading enemy of the Taliban is murdered and that's your time? I don't know. It went through my mind when I started going back through the news stories rather than forward. But again, I think you have to come back round to the question of bin Laden, where is he? Even if the Americans know where he is, how do they get to him? Can you really land paratroopers on a bare mountainside in Afghanistan? They have no friends. I mean, the Russians had some friends. They thought they had the communist government of Babrak Karmal when they went in there, 79, 80. The British used to think they had friends in Afghanistan.
Robert Fisk? Well, that is one way to end a conversation. That was Robert Fisk speaking to us from Beirut, Lebanon. He has this last piece in the Independent newspaper. He's been the Mideast correspondent for the Independent in London for, more than 20 years, based in Beirut, is called Stunned into Disbelief as Their Normal Son is Blamed. Robert Fisk in Al-Marj, Lebanon, meets the family of Ziad Jarrah, who died trying to destroy the White House. Robert Fisk is also the reporter who spoke with Osama bin Laden in March of 1997 in the mountains of Afghanistan. We didn't break at our usual time today because we didn't want to lose Robert Fisk in Beirut. We'll break now, and when we come back, we'll hear for a moment from a peace vigil that took place in Union Square, and then we'll go to attorney Michael Ratner to talk about the counterterrorism measures that are being introduced rapidly into the U.S. Congress as we broadcast to you from now just outside the evacuation zone in downtown Manhattan, blocks from where the World Trade Center used to stand. You're listening to Democracy Now! In Exile as we break the sound barrier. Stay with us. I'm Amy Goodman. 2 Asian men were murdered this weekend in what appeared to be the first racist revenge killings for last week's attacks. One was a Pakistani Muslim, the other an Indian Sikh, who may have been attacked because his beard and turban reminded his attackers of Osama bin Laden, the man who has been accused of being behind the 2 attacks. In Pleasant Grove, a middle-class suburb of Dallas, Texas, Waqar Hassan Chowdhury was shot dead at a convenience store shortly after 10 p.m. on Saturday night. There was no evidence of a robbery, and local detectives told Chowdhury's family they believed his killing was motivated by blind revenge. In Mesa, Arizona, a suburb of Phoenix, police reported that 52-year-old Balbir Singh Sodhi was shot dead by a white male who drove a pickup truck into Sodhi's Chevron station and opened fire with a handgun on Saturday afternoon. That killing was apparently the opening salvo in a shooting spree that led the unnamed assailant to attack 2 other gas stations, at least one of which was run by men of Arab origin. At a vigil held in Union Square in New York on Friday night, just a few blocks north of here where we're broadcasting from, mourners and peace activists spoke out against anti-Arab violence. We go there now.
We are a loose coalition of people who came together a few days ago just in response, knowing that there was going to be a need for a long-standing ability to build a sustainable movement against potential war, and also to be aware and raising awareness around anti-Arab and anti-Muslim attacks in the United States as well. So we're really here to try to kind of stand for 3 primary points. One is to talk about creating space to mourn the victims at the same time as standing for peace and being in a position to talk about violence that's happening in the United States right now against people who are perceived to be Arab or Muslim and other immigrants, and in addition to really begin building a movement to oppose the huge war effort that's clearly about to begin.
I have seen that life persists in the midst of destruction. Therefore, there must be a higher law than the law of destruction. That was Gandhi, and I was overcome with sadness, of course, like everybody is. I'm missing a friend, a captain in the fire department, waiting to hear. He's still unaccounted for. And I was sitting next to a complete stranger and just reached out and put my hand on her shoulder and name is Ellie. She's right here. She's standing up right now. And you know, we hugged each other, and that's sort of what symbolizes this thing for me, is people just that would never talk or deal with each other are just, we are all completely connected at the deepest level. It's astounding and inspiring. And there are a lot of people carrying signs of you know, violence is not the answer, you know, promoting peace this time of nightmare, and people singing, which is amazing. There was a beautiful woman just singing before a spiritual hymn, and I think that it's really wonderful that we're all coming together and helping each other and talking to each other and expressing our anger and our grief and our hopelessness and our hope.
We're a nation of resolve. We're a nation that can't be cowed by evildoers. I got great faith in the American people. If the American people had seen what I had seen in New York City, you'd have great faith too. You'd have faith in the hard work of the rescuers. You'd have great faith because of the desire for people to do what's right for America. You'd have great faith because of the compassion and love that our fellow Americans are showing each other in times of need. I also have faith in our military. And we have got a job to do. Just like the farmers and ranchers and business owners and factory workers have a job to do, my administration has a job to do. And we're going to do it. We will rid the world of the evildoers. We will call together freedom-loving people to fight terrorism. And so on this day on the Lord's Day, I say to my fellow Americans, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your compassion, thank you for your love for one another. And tomorrow when you get back to work hard like you always have. But we've been warned. We've been warned there are evil people in this world. We've been warned so vividly. And we'll be alert. Your government is alert. The governors and mayors are alert.
President Bush speaking yesterday as he returned from Camp David. In the wake of the terror attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Congress moved swiftly to condemn the attacks and pour money into the military, $40 billion by this weekend. On Saturday, Congress also passed resolutions in the House and Senate authorizing, quote, the use of force against terrorists. The votes were 420 to 1 in the House. Only East Bay Congressmember Barbara Lee voting against the resolution, and 100 to 0 in the Senate. Bush administration officials and congressional leaders have pounded on the theme that the U.S. is at war, with little discussion of what it means to pass an open-ended resolution authorizing military action abroad. Administration and congressional officials also said this weekend they're considering loosening a 25-year-old ban on the assassination of foreigners and a more recent ban on the CIA using human rights abusers as agents. And the Justice Department and FBI are sending a wide-ranging set of proposals to Congress this week that would include more power to conduct wiretaps, detain foreigners, and track financial interactions. Civil liberties advocates worry these measures could constitute a massive erosion of civil liberties and the right to privacy. We're joined on the telephone right now by Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Michael, welcome to Democracy Now! In Exile.
Good morning, Amy.
At another point, I'll talk to you with our listeners about your watching the plane fly into the World Trade Center as you were running. But right now, with the minutes we have, let's talk about the the vote this past weekend, the resolution for the joint resolution that authorizes the United States Armed Forces to go to war.
The problem with, for me, with a resolution such as the one that was passed, with the exception of Barbara Lee's vote, is you combine that resolution with the rhetoric and the speeches coming out of the White House in Washington, which rhetoric is basically, to me, one of revenge, one of pulverizing other countries, one of bombing them into submission, and you combine that rhetoric of our leaders in Washington with what that resolution, the authority that resolution gives them, and you have to be very, very frightened. The resolution basically says nothing about who the target is or what the target is, names no country, names no organization, names no person. It has no time limit, so that basically the President under this resolution can make war forever. It has no congressional oversight. He doesn't have to come back to Congress and tell them, oh, today I plan to hit Afghanistan, tomorrow I plan to hit Pakistan, the next day I plan to hit the Sudan. Doesn't say anything about coming back, reporting to Congress or anything. And it's very broad. It uses a term like that the President can use military force against anyone who is aided in the terrorism that took place on September 11th. A very broad term that could imply people who even give rhetorical support, not to the terrorism incident, but to whoever the terrorists were in terms of their goals, whatever they be. So it's a very, very scary resolution in the sense that everything is now up to the President, and it's what I would call, and what worries me is what I would call cowboy politics in that White House, which is one of revenge. We have to do something for the American people, and it's almost on the international scale what you're getting is what some people are doing to Arab Americans on the domestic scale.
On the issue of the assassination ban being lifted, can you talk about the significance of this, where it came from in '75 and '76, and why more restrictions were put on working with human rights abusers as well in the last few years?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say about these so-called lifting of these assassination bans and working with human rights abusers is that they're using, I think, this September 11th terrorism incident as an excuse for really beefing up that kind of thing and lifting whatever restrictions that were hard fought and won in the 70s. I don't think they need that to go after the people who did September 11th. I mean, if they really believe that bin Laden was behind it, they've known that for 3 or 5 years. They've known it since the bombings in East Africa. They've known it since the SS Cole. So what do they need to lift these kind of bans for? That's the first point. The second point is these bans don't seem to have had the effect they wanted. I mean, I think most of your listeners know that they tried to kill Gaddafi in Libya despite the ban on assassinations. They used torturers to kill Jennifer Harberry's husband in Guatemala, and to get it, then I got information from him. So I don't think these bans, I think they're there in word, but not in deed. They came out of a period when there were, of course, a number of assassinations done by the CIA throughout the world. And during the 70s, post-Vietnam, we started to get a whole bunch of limitations on the intelligence agencies. But as I said, I don't think that they have been obeyed, basically. But to the extent that they're going to use this incident to really open up surveillance and lift whatever restrictions that were hard fought on the CIA is just adding to the tragedy.
There were senators this weekend who were talking well beyond the assassination ban being lifted for Osama bin Laden. They were saying that, in fact, you have to go well beyond him when you're talking about going after people. Not clear who they were specifically referring to.
Well, that's what's worrisome about these kind of resolutions, that if there are perpetrators of September 11th, the United States government should, with other governments, try and find out who those people are, go through legal processes, whether through the UN or U.S. extradition, try and get those people tried as they need to be, and go forward from there. If, obviously, people are imminently planning another attack on the United States or in that process, then the U.S. would have a right to use force against those particular people. But to begin to broaden it, and the way this resolution allows the president, without really showing any evidence, to broaden it, will give the U.S. Powers the chance to really get rid of a lot of people that aren't just the September 11th people. And that's very worrisome. And what's really worrisome is the reaction that we're going to get. I look at the bombing that the U.S. did of the pharmaceutical plant in Sudan and the earlier missiles that Clinton threw into Afghanistan, and you have to ask yourself, was that a factor in creating more people who want to be terrorists against the United States? And what worries you with an open-ended resolution like this is that it's going to, I'm afraid, engender more violence rather than a much narrower resolution that really goes after the perpetrators. The one positive thing I can say on this is there seems to be some caution coming in. I think the speech you played from Bush on his return from New York was slightly less rhetorical, slightly less revenge-like. I think the European countries are beginning to say this should not be any kind of knee-jerk, massive retaliatory bombing. This is not about retaliation. It's not about revenge, although that's what many Americans emotionally feel like. It's about finding out who did it and stopping it from happening again.
Several Democrats are saying many senators don't know exactly what they're voting on and are supporting measures and determination to condemn terrorism. So you take the civil liberties restrictions. I mean, how serious can we get here, which have historically fallen hardest on political dissidents?
Well, I think it's really serious. I mean, I have to tell you, I got called by the USA Today yesterday about a poll they took of Americans that said something like 59% felt there should be restrictions on Arab American citizens, whether it be by identity card or some other way. The last time we saw that, obviously, in a legal way, was with the Japanese during the Second World War. But I think there may well be a number, if not a majority, of Americans who want that. I mean, to the extent that's been positive is both Mayor Giuliani and President Bush have said something against, have basically condemned that. But if you have the government on the one hand saying, we have to just get these people, we have to bomb them overseas, and they're sort of making indiscriminate remarks about who they have to get, then you would expect Americans living here to also make indiscriminate or indiscriminate attacks on Arab Americans and others in the United States. It's obviously one thing we have to fight against very, very heavily here. It's obviously a key thing.
Michael Ratner, our guest, and I hope that you will come join us at the firehouse of Engine 31. We're now just outside the evacuation zone, and what we're attempting to do now is for our listeners to be able to come to the station house when we broadcast every morning 9 to 11 for these 2-hour specials, Eastern Standard Time, so that especially listeners in New York who are not hearing us on WBAI can actually come and listen to the program. We invite you down, and this is just outside the evacuation zone now. It's gotten a little bit smaller so that while police still stand at Canal Street, it is easier to get in. Michael Ratner, who actually, Michael, you witnessed the attacks on the World Trade Center just by chance.
Yes, I was actually down in Lower Manhattan on my morning run at about, sometime before 9. I'm right at really 300 yards from the World Trade Center. I look up, and there's a huge explosion in the North Tower. I didn't actually see the plane go in. I stopped for a minute to talk to construction workers. They tell me that they saw the plane go right in. At that point, you're saying, boy, for a direct hit like that, it can't be accident. We sit there talking for 15 minutes. Right over my head, maybe 300 yards over my head, another plane comes in on a tilt on a curve. I thought naively, well, maybe it's going to drop water or looking to see the damage. And then it curves around the back, and I saw it go slam right into the building. At that point, we all knew that this was no accident, and people just took off running, staying away from any high buildings. At that point, you didn't know what the next thing would be. When we were looking up at the first building, of course, it was quite high, but you saw debris and presumably people just jumping out.
Well, Michael Ratner, thanks for being with us, and we have a lot to analyze in the coming days as the different laws and regulations come down in Washington, D.C. Again, as we broadcast just blocks from where right now hundreds or thousands of evacuation workers and emergency medical people stand by as they continue to comb through the rubble. That does it for today's program. Democracy Now! Broadcasting from downtown community television. We're also broadcasting on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, MNN, Channel 35, as we will be throughout the week. And we invite you to 87 Lafayette Street, just 2 blocks below Canal, to be a part of this program every morning, 9 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. Democracy Now! In Exile is produced by Chris Abrams, Brad Simpson, and Miranda Kennedy. Anthony Sloan is our music maestro and engineer. Errol Maitland at WBIX.org, where you can hear us, as well as webactive.com. Special thanks to Chase Pearson, Tony Riddle, Rick Youngers, Karen Ranucci, as well as John Alpert and Keiko Tsuno. Thank you to the Pacifica stations, especially KPFA and KFCF in Fresno, and of course all of our affiliates around the country. We are Pacifica. If you're listening online, encourage your Pacifica station to broadcast these specials from Ground Zero Radio. Broadcasting from DCTV in Exile, from the embattled studios of WBAI, from the studios of the Band and the Fired, from the studios of our listeners, I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening to another edition of Democracy Now! In Exile, the War and Peace Report. Already one of the poorest countries after more than 20 years of invasion, occupation, and civil war. A team of senior Pakistan officials is to fly to Kandahar today to press the ruling Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden and help prevent a potential catastrophe in the region. The Taliban, however, continue to insist neither they nor bin Laden had the capacity to organize an international plot that saw trained pilots hijack large passenger jets in Boston and Washington. The spiritual leader of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement, Mullah Muhammad Omar, yesterday called an urgent council of senior Islamic clerics to discuss the situation. Mullah Omar on Saturday issued a call for jihad against the United States and neighboring states such as traditional supporter Pakistan if they attacked or assisted an attack on Afghanistan. We're joined right now by Thomas Guittierre. He serves as the Dean of International Studies and Programs at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and is the Director of the Center for Afghanistan Studies at UNO. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Good morning.
It's good to have you with us. Well, can you tell us the latest you're hearing now from Afghanistan?
Well, I'm not hearing much. Afghanistan doesn't have much electricity and it has no trunk lines, but what I'm hearing, of course, is that we have a situation where the Pakistanis are meeting with the Taliban to try and convince them to turn over Osama bin Laden, as you indicated. And I think there's an important element to this whole matter. Well, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden were brought together, in fact, by the Pakistanis in the late spring and summer of 1996. The Pakistani military has had a strategic objective in Afghanistan and Central Asia, largely because of its concern about its eastern borders. So Afghanistan being to the west has been the central piece in something that the Pakistanis call strategic Islamic depth. And in Afghanistan, after the Soviet War, due to reasons that are too long to go into here, but there was a vacuum that was created by the inability of any of the resistance parties to come to put together an effective government. And eventually the Pakistanis, who had been backing some of them, realized that they were not going to be successful and backed the Taliban, another group that rose up in Afghanistan during this period. And it was a group that was very dependent upon Pakistan's military, particularly its intelligence, military strategy, and also recruits from Pakistan's extremist religion madrasa schools. And thousands literally came to Afghanistan to fight on behalf of the Taliban against the other particular warlords within Afghanistan. When I was there in 96, 97 working with the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan, I saw convoys of these people none of whom could speak Persian or Pashto, the two major languages of Afghanistan, because they were indeed not Afghans. Into this mix, the Pakistanis brokered
From Ground Zero, this is Democracy Now! In Exile, the War and Peace Report.
I purposely want to stand next to Muslims and Christians and Jews and members of all other faiths for one simple reason: because terrorism does not want us to stand together. The most effective response here is that we of different faiths stand together.
We do not want to become the evil that we condemn, and I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
People flee Afghanistan fearing a U.S. attack. We go to Lebanon to speak with Robert Fisk, who interviewed Osama bin Laden, and we'll hear from peace activists who march throughout the country. Stay with us. Welcome to Democracy Now! In Exile, Resistance Radio, breaking the sound barrier. I'm Amy Goodman. Pakistan sent a group of high-ranking military officers to Afghanistan today to demand the Taliban government hand over the accused Osama bin Laden and his top associates to the United States or face almost certain U.S. military action. The group is led by one of the top officers in Pakistan's military intelligence wing, which is thought to have unique intelligence on bin Laden's operations in Afghanistan and his whereabouts. But Pakistani officials caution that the chance of the Taliban bowing to the American demand is slim. The Taliban leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, has already said in a defiant, warlike radio speech on Friday he believed handing over bin Laden would not spare Afghanistan from a U.S. attack. The Pakistani president, General Pervez Musharraf, agreed to relay the ultimatum after days of intensive discussion.
The return of Osama bin Laden, who had been fighting on behalf of the Afghans against the Soviets and went back to Saudi Arabia, was thrown out of there for demonstrating against American presence there and against the lacking of Islamic character of the Saudi regime, went to Sudan to establish training camps to fight against the West now, and then was thrown out of there due to Saudi and American pressure, and went back to Afghanistan as a result of the efforts of the Pakistani Army's military intelligence to put them together, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, both to help them, the Pakistanis, achieve their objectives. So you've asked me what I know about now. I'm trying to give you a kind of a background of all the characters now, all the players in this very moment who are meeting one with each other in some form or another, and how it plays together. This is what I would call an unholy alliance that was constituted in 1996. The Pakistanis recognize that the whole situation is becoming a real mess for them, because Pakistan is on the verge in some ways of becoming a failed state because of the unrest in the country, the ineffectiveness of the democratic governments that preceded this latest version of the military government, and they know that a lot of the young people who were trained for fighting in Afghanistan and Kashmir, when coming back, are not pleased with what they consider to be the lack of extreme Islamic nature of their government either. So they've got their own kind of chickens coming home to roost, and they probably see this as an opportunity to reestablish control in a secular fashion over their nation.
What about the relationship between U.S. intelligence, which helped to train Osama bin Laden and other Islamic militants in Afghanistan in fighting the Soviets, along with the British intelligence and Pakistani intelligence, and their relationship with these intelligence organizations today?
Well, I think we need to understand that that was going on, and but I think that the primary contacts between Osama bin Laden and anything that was going on relating to this war was through the Pakistani intelligence. That's not to say that it didn't have at least some connection with our own, interests and objectives and strategies there. The thing to remember is that was a different era. In 1989, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in ignominious defeat. At Thanksgiving time that same year, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union was history. That was a different era, a different time, and you got to remember that those were the Afghans who remained behind to fight against the Soviet Union. And a lot of the others left and went to be refugees, but these people fought. And unfortunately, as I indicated earlier, those who did the fighting were unable themselves to put together a cohesive government because this was a tribal society that had worked centuries to create a social fabric, a social infrastructure. The war, the Soviet war, devastated
and track money laundering cases. Vice President Cheney said yesterday that CIA field officers may be allowed to recruit and pay overseas agents linked to terrorist groups and human rights abuses, saying it was necessary to infiltrate suspected terrorist cells. In addition, Florida Democratic Senator Bob Graham, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, says he'll introduce a counterterrorism package next week that would create a counterterrorism czar inside the White House and establish authority for the CIA to recruit unsavory agents. And Secretary of State Colin Powell says the administration is reviewing an executive order issued by President Gerald Ford in 1976 that bans U.S. personnel from engaging in or conspiring to engage in assassinations. Some intelligence and terrorism experts have advocated assassinating Osama bin Laden, the exiled Saudi millionaire who lives in hiding in Afghanistan and has been named by the United States as the prime suspect in last week's attacks. The Senate last week approved legislation that would make it easier for the FBI to get warrants for electronic surveillance of computer transmissions. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Patrick Leahy, the Vermont Democrat, called the measure overly broad and an encroachment on civil liberties. He said we have to be careful in our horror and revulsion over this horrendous and terrible act that we don't start giving away the freedoms that make us different from terrorists. Several Democrats said many senators did not know exactly what they were voting on and supported the measure in their determination to condemn terrorism. Time will tell. Bob Marley and the Wailers here on Democracy Now! In Exile Resistance Radio. I'm Amy Goodman. Officials from Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement have started to flee the capital Kabul amid growing expectations of U.S. attacks. Fear of reprisal has triggered a rush to get families out of the cities. Thousands of people have flooded over the eastern border to the already overflowing refugee camps of Pakistan. Those who couldn't leave are bracing for war, stocking up on food as prices soar and the Afghan currency slides. With Iran announcing it is sealing its eastern border with Afghanistan, opposition fighters controlling a narrow northern corridor, and Pakistan pledging to support U.S. anti-terrorism efforts, Kabul residents are feeling increasingly vulnerable. Afghanistan has discussions with U.S. officials. General Musharraf reportedly assured President Bush in a telephone call on Saturday that Pakistan would allow the use of its airspace and airfields if needed, as well as full access to Pakistani intelligence on bin Laden. According to the Pakistani officials, U.S. officials had told General Musharraf's government that Washington would use every lever short of war to punish Pakistan unless it cooperated. General Musharraf was said to have made a number of demands in return for Pakistan's cooperation, including an end to economic sanctions imposed by Washington after Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in 1998, the lifting of an American ban on weapons sales, a pledge that Washington would assist Pakistan's battered economy by encouraging generous treatment by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and a shift in Pakistan's favor in its dispute with India over the Kashmir region. Meanwhile, Pakistani civilians gathered to protest their government's collaboration with the United States. This news from Afghanistan: tens of thousands of Afghans are streaming out of major cities and headed toward the borders with Pakistan and Iran amid fears the United States is preparing to unleash a war on the land that has harbored Osama bin Laden. Iran has sealed its border with Afghanistan. Taliban officials of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement have also started to flee the capital, Kabul. Yesterday, the Taliban ordered all foreigners out, saying their safety could no longer be guaranteed. These who couldn't leave were bracing for war, stocking up on food as prices soared and the Afghani currency slid. Meanwhile, Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban supreme leader, summoned religious scholars to the capital to discuss waging a jihad, a holy war against the U.S. Nearly 1,000 elders and Islamic scholars from across Afghanistan are expected to attend a meeting tomorrow. More than 3,000 U.S. Marines and sailors rehearsed helicopter and ship-to-shore landings off East Timor Sunday amid expectations of a revenge strike over the terror attacks on New York and Washington. The task force from the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit and Amphibious Squadron 1 had been due to disembark troops for humanitarian work in Dili, the capital of Swai and Waiakusi enclave in Indonesian West Timor. Instead, 3 amphibious ships led by the 40,000-ton USS Peleliu stayed off the north coast of the capital, practicing naval and air maneuvers with Harrier jets, helicopters, and landing craft. Before 2 passenger jets slammed into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center and a third into the Pentagon in Washington, the warships were on a routine 6-month deployment to the Western Pacific and Arabian Gulf. U.S. Army spokesperson Major Paul Van Bremen told Reuters in Dili the task force is due to sail for the Waiakusi enclave today to deliver humanitarian supplies before heading to Singapore. He said, after that, I'm not really sure they'll go, but they're part of a much bigger force. And Bush administration officials said yesterday they're considering lifting a 25-year-old ban on U.S. involvement in foreign assassinations and loosening restrictions on FBI surveillance. They said the Justice Department plans to send a wide-ranging set of proposals to Capitol Hill this week that would include more power to conduct wiretaps, detain foreign